Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar this evening, unpacking the Cleveland.com delinquent series. My name is Leah Winsberg. I'm the Senior Policy Attorney with the Children's Law Center, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sion Blackwell, the Youth Justice Policy Associate with the Children's Law Center, Gabriela Celeste, Policy Director at the Schubert Center for Child Studies at Case Western Reserve University, and Pat Glaydura, Policy Strategist with the ACLU of Ohio. Our team makes up the Greater Cleveland Youth Justice Collective, and we're working collaboratively to shed light on critical issues our justice-involved youth are facing, and to shift the narrative and strategies to reform our justice system in Northeast Ohio. Our collaborative work is made possible by the generous support from the George Gund Foundation. So during tonight's program, we're going to explore with journalists of the Delinquent series about elevating youth perspective in the media. So we'll have an hour of moderated questions, and then we'll pivot to take audience questions around 6 p.m. So please feel free to use the Q&A box in the webinar as we move along. Feel free to drop your questions in as we go. We will conclude the program by 6:30, and the webinar will be recorded, so a link will be sent out to all of the registrants. And during the program, we will also be putting links in our chat so that you can check out websites and other resources from each of our organizations. That will include this recorded webinar once the evening concludes, as well as resources from each of our collective organizations and our first webinar that our collective did on narratives of justice-involved youth. So we are thrilled to be joined by the Delinquent Series reporters, John H. Tucker and Caitlin Durbin. John covered crime and police for the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com and is transitioning to Cuyahoga County courts. He's written about criminal justice issues for newspapers in St. Louis and Raleigh-Durham, along with national and regional magazines. And Caitlin is a county government reporter for the Plain Dealer and previously spent 9 years covering crime and public safety at papers in Ohio and Colorado. She's Ohio raised and followed her brother here to Cleveland to be the best aunt to her niece and 2 nephews. So thank you, John and Caitlin, for joining us for this conversation. I would like to kick it off with a question for both of you, actually. So when you set out to do this reporting series, what was the goal that you hoped to achieve, and what did you really want your readers to take away?
John, do you want me to start?
Go for it. Absolutely.
Okay. So I think it was no secret at the time that we bind over more youth than anywhere else in Ohio. And so it was just obvious that something was happening here that wasn't happening somewhere elsewhere in the state, including like other counties combined. You know, we were sending more kids to adult prison. And so that's kind of what started this series, to figure out what are we doing here that others aren't doing, and why is this happening here more often? And so we tried to look inside, not just at the system, but like what is bringing kids to the system and why can't they get out of it before they go on to prison?
Yeah, the theory was that these kids might be frequent flyers. They're not necessarily new to the system. So if you can kind of identify them as midway through, maybe they stole a pack of gum, maybe they committed a misdemeanor assault, maybe they're running around breaking curfew. Like, that's not the path that we want them to be on. So we hear about the end game when they are downtown in adult court, but can we interrupt that path with some sort of service or some sort of program that can keep future kids from getting there? And like Caitlin said, like, we didn't want to necessarily absolve the carjacker who's sticking a gun into the face of an innocent victim. There are good people who can have good arguments about whether or not they should be bound over at that point. But 2 years ago, like, what was that kid's life like? You didn't wake up one day and have a gun, an assault weapon in your hand and go looking for victims. Something happened that took more than a day, a week, a year, an adolescence. And what were those things?
So it sounds like providing context to how young people ended up in the system was a part of the goal that both of you hope to, really achieve for the readers. And your responses, point out there were 2 questions that the series specifically set to address. And the first was, is Cuyahoga County's justice system working as designed? I know, Caitlin, you talked about kind of the disparities between the number of youth being bound over in Cuyahoga County compared to all other counties in Ohio. And then the second question you set up to answer was, at what point did our systems potentially fail the kids who are in adult prisons in Ohio today? So you touched a little bit on both of these, but I'm wondering if one of you would like to dive in as to, is there a clear answer to either or both of those questions that you found in your reporting? And if so, can you kind of talk us through that?
I think you can make an argument that the system failed at numerous points, right? It could be on the prevention side. It could be when they already touched the system and they weren't diverted. Why weren't they diverted? I mean, there's numerous answers. But for me, it all comes down to the law. And what we really saw is how much power the prosecutor has in deciding the fate of these kids. And when you see, I pointed out that our county does something that no other county does, and that is we send more youth to prison. And we were the second county in the nation to have a juvenile court. And that means that we have had more practice in this area than anyone else. And we should be the leader in showing people how to divert kids and put kids on a good path and to stop sending so many to prison. And in fact, we are the opposite. And so that to me comes down a lot on what the prosecutor is doing, and the decisions they make, not only in who gets bound over, but who gets diversion and what other programs that kids have access to while they touch the juvenile system.
And that's all 100% true. And I'm glad that you kind of plucked out those two questions that came, I think, from the original story in our series. And I think that sometimes it might be a cop-out, but as journalists, like our role, maybe we're not smart enough to give the answer. I mean, we've kind of become expert in this kind of thing, but not nearly as expert as the people in this world. So rather than kind of take a hard stance because we are as journalists and not advocates on the answer, we wanted to spotlight those questions. And I think the answer is that most of the time, the system does work. The majority of the time, for sure. But many times it doesn't, as we all know. And then, many would argue that there have been flaws and failures along the way. And like I said, I'm not here to say this is the problem and, we need to spotlight this problem, but to help shed light on the debate. There are a few things I think that we kind of captured that help inform the debate. There are just a few things that I plucked out. Like, one is the amount of therapists that Cuyahoga County employs to do a specific intensive form of therapy in the household that we know works. Everybody agrees that it works. They're budgeted for 8 therapists. We have 2 therapists employed. So 25% manpower. When we know that the process works, if we have the boots on the ground, that could be construed as a problem. Another thing
Are
that we
you referring to multi-systemic therapy? Is that the model that you're okay? I just wanted to
basically
clarify
yeah,
that.
not just treating the kid out in the therapist's office, but going into the home, treating the kid, treating mom, treating auntie, treating the sister, and really looking at this as a unit because that's their living environment. That was one thing. I think what we also found was that when you think about these quote unquote frequent flyers, we think that so many of these kids went through the system and it's a revolving door and they don't, they're not taking advantage of some of the opportunities, some might argue. And the system is designed to rehabilitate the kid and offer them second chances. We did find that for, I think, 14% of these kids who were ultimately bound over, they either didn't have a criminal record or they had one charge on their record. So that means no intervention chances, no turns through any kind of programs that could help lead them off that path. 14%, not nothing. So that I think surprised people. And some of those crimes were homicide crimes, and some could argue that one and done with homicides bind them over, but most of them were not homicide crimes. Most of them were gun crimes that were not homicides. And then the third thing that popped up in my mind is, I'll try and summarize, the system is meant to bind the kids over who are not redeemable by the juvenile system that goes up until age 21, right? So if they can be reformed before age 21, keep them in the youth system where they have access to programs that are designed for kids, whereas in the adult system, not designed for kids, and kids can go there and be subject to physical abuse and higher risk for suicide and recidivate, etc. What we found was that 14% of kids who get bound over end up leaving, getting released from adult prison before they're 21. So that frustrates a lot of people because they say, what is the point? What is the point of binding a kid over, taking away from youth services to adult prison designed for adults, and then they get out before 21? 14%, again, not nothing, and then they oftentimes go on to recidivate. So again, not taking a stance on this is the answer, but just observing a few things that stood out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think some of those data points are really helpful. And, when we think if we have 100 or so young people being bound over, 14% is a fair number of youth who either didn't have access to the opportunity to benefit from rehabilitation and now is saddled with collateral consequences. So putting the data to actual young people like you all did with the voices and experiences, I think helps remind us that the data is actually a young person. So in terms of reporting and investigating in that way, telling the story and the journalism through the voice of the young people who are experiencing the system, can you tell me what struck you the most in approaching the reporting that way?
John?
The one thing that struck me the most is these kids, this is the first time anyone asked their opinion. And, once we connected with them, first of all, they're kind of flabbergasted. And second of all, they have to get past a lot of, I think, distrust. But once they realize that we're not cops, which some of them thought we were, or at least I was, they wanted to talk. And they said, thank you for just kind of like asking. No one's really posed the question to me. They're not absolving themselves for some of the things they did, most of them. But they said, you're acknowledging my thoughts, and I really appreciate that. And some of them also said, like, what can I get out of participating? Can this help me with my sentence? And the answer was no. We're not using their names, and you just kind of have to be honest and say the point is not to help you. We can't, but you can be a part of helping someone else who might be in a similar situation as you are if we can improve the system some way, somehow. And they were down with it. For the most part, some of them talked like 50-year-olds because they talked about these kids today. They're 20, they're 21. They say, I've got to help the kids. The kids need this, or, the younger generation has it so much worse than I did 3 years ago. So just the opportunity to be heard and not necessarily say I'm innocent was new to them.
And just to piggyback off that a little bit, kind of in the same vein, what struck me was, we all know the answer to the problem, and we use these blanket terms to describe it: poverty, neglect, abuse, but we don't actually know what those things mean. Even me, working in the being a criminal reporter for 9 years, I don't really know what abuse looks like. And when we started talking to these kids, we're hearing, I am boiling water for my bath, and I'm sharing a 5-piece chicken nugget meal with my 3 siblings, and that is my meal for the day. And so really understanding what they are going through, and that is the whole point of this. That's going to point to the prevention piece, and also it humanizes them, because a lot of times, especially with all the reporting of the car thefts, we hear, lock them away. These kids deserve to have the book thrown at them. How dare they touch my property? But when you really see what they're going through and what they're up against, it maybe makes you take a step back and ask yourself, what would I do in that situation? And there's this quote from Brene Brown that I just love, and I always put at the forefront of my reporting. It's, you can't hate people up close, move in. And so that's kind of what we wanted to do, is take a real look at who these kids are and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And hopefully that will lead to some solutions to prevent it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those observations are striking, and just knowing that young people who have been through this are hopeful that whatever their story is can hopefully help somebody else who's in a situation that they couldn't extricate themselves from. So I do just want to mention a quick reminder to put all of your questions in the Q&A box. I think there was someone that had their hand up. We're going to, once we transition at 6 o'clock, pull questions from there. So please go ahead and use that function throughout this conversation.
Thank you. And Thank you, Caitlin. I think your last answer really transitions well into this next question, and I'd love to hear from both of you on this. There was a particular attention paid to the harm and traumas kids had suffered throughout their lives before, during, and after their justice involvement. Could you tell us more about how you both explored these in the young people that you spoke to, and kind of the approach you took throughout the process?
So to start the project, we thought we were going to rely heavily on records, particularly pertaining to the abuse that these youth have suffered. And that was through DCFS records. And we worked with DCFS and we worked through the county trying to get access to these records for almost a year before the project even began. And when that didn't happen, we took another route. So we actually worked through juvenile court to get access to probation records. And a lot of times we had to get permission from the families or the kids themselves to get these records through a court order. And that really showed their history of what the court knew of the abuse and trauma and neglect that they had suffered. But really, it all comes down to the trust and the relationship we had with the kids, for them telling us a lot of this information that wasn't in the reports themselves. And then I know John's just itching to talk about the police reports as well.
Well, I'm itching to talk about it because this was following your lead. I mean, you took the charge on this, but not only did we get access to the typically sealed probation reports from the court through their cooperation, but we did like background checks on each kid that we worked with through a request of their entire police report, every incident linked to their name. And some of those files, they came back, it could be a month, it could be 2 months, it could be 3 months, but they were pretty thick. And we found that they were linked to a few crimes. I mean, we had their case history, so we knew what crimes they were going to be linked to. But the reason they were so thick, for the most part, was because they were victims of so many other crimes, many in the household, but also out of the house. They had just been kind of susceptible to violent act upon violent act, and sometimes they were just witnesses to violent acts in the household. Sometimes their records came back to like age 3, when a policeman is calling a daycare center is calling the police saying this 3-year-old has bruises from his head to his feet. So we took stock of every single incident they were involved in, a lot of runaways too. And we had a pretty major timeline on every traumatic event they suffered that was just reported to the police. So that's where a lot of the information came from. And like Caitlin said, we asked them. It was tough. It was tough to ask that kind of question. Many of them are going to put up guardrails. You read their body language and they don't want to talk about it. There wasn't, everybody had their own way of addressing it, and you pretty quickly knew when they didn't want to talk about it. So a stock question that I might ask is, is it fair to say that you experienced some trauma in your life, in your child? Said yes. That was a way for me to say, okay, I'm moving on. I remember one kid, I asked the question, and he paused for like 5 minutes, and he said, you know what? I'm going to do it. It's for the kids. And he went into an episode where he was molested. And he said, I've never said this to anybody. Maybe he said outside my family, but he was open about it. We were anonymous with the names for many reasons, and maybe that helped a little bit. And certainly, like, this is not the first question you ask when you're having a conversation with them. But if you have time and you can have a few different follow-up conversations, then you start to realize, yeah, the studies said they're linked. Kids who touch the system are linked to trauma, but out of the mouth of the horse, it becomes a lot more real.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say, the last thing I'll say is, in terms of common denominators, I would say domestic violence in the house was a through line throughout so much, and not necessarily them getting beat, but boyfriends beating their moms. And also the other thing I learned was in the streets. I was in the streets. That literally meant in the streets. That didn't mean like I was running around by day in the streets. That meant I was living in abandoned homes. That's what in the streets meant. And that's obviously trauma.
Yeah. And that's, it really sounds like you were able to paint like full pictures of these youth throughout your conversations and these reports. Were there any pieces or parts of this that were particularly impactful to you as the reporters, and how was that translated, or did you want to translate those feelings or emotions onto the page?
One of the things that struck me was, so a lot of these kids have, this was like the surprising thing. They come from traumatic backgrounds, and so many of us are able to recognize the trauma, maybe go to therapy and say, I don't like this. I despise this. This is awful. Some of these kids didn't seek to normalize it, but they had accepted it in a way, maybe through some sort of cognitive dissonance process. They were okay with it. It made me who I am, is the refrain that I heard a lot. It made me who I am. And I remember talking to a kid who was talking about his mom beating him, and he's having this internal tumultuous dialogue in his head as he's talking to me. Whips and cords, that traumatizes kids. It's modern day slavery. Next breath. But it toughened me up. My mom didn't spoil me. It made me who I am. Next breath. People don't realize that that can set people up and put them down the wrong path, and it's awful. And he's debating. He's talking to himself. He's not talking to me, and I'm just like, oh wow, that's heavy.
Yeah, and I think Tyson was a really interesting character for me that I grew quite close with over the course of my reporting. And what really struck me with him, and it was a common theme with a lot of these kids, is they don't even necessarily recognize their own trauma because they've normalized it. It's what their parents went through, and now it's what they go through. It's what they see their siblings going through. And so he talked a lot about the need for therapy, but didn't know how to access it. And so, even talking to his mom, she's like, he asked me if he could go to therapy, but I didn't know where to start. So we haven't even pursued that angle. And so there definitely needs to be some more resources in the juvenile justice community to help families and these kids access some resources to address some of these things outside of being court involved.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for both of you for taking the time and attention to wade through these things with the youth. I think it really came through in your reporting. So.
So, throughout the series, you really highlighted teen brain development and how the juvenile justice system is, at least theoretically, built on this principle that children have the capacity for change as they grow and mature. How, if at all, was this understanding of teen development, reflected in these youth stories, or how the cases, were handled?
For me, one of my biggest pet peeves throughout this series was this portrayal of these kids, especially when you hear what they're accused of or even convicted of, that they're just bad eggs and there's nothing that can be done for them, like almost cast aside, like there's no hope for them. And when you actually talk to these kids and you read their stories, which we profiled several of them, you see that that's not true, and you have these stories of redemption with Sam, who did one of the most unthinkable crimes, right? He attempted murder, tried to poison his grandfather and his grandfather's fiance. And if you just look at the crime, it seems like there's nothing that can be done. Other kids that did similar crimes or accused of similar things, they went on to prison, but Sam received services and was able to get help, and now is doing incredibly well, like MVP of his golf team, and he's dreaming of college, something that he didn't dream about before. And you also have stories of Carter, who looked on paper to be the worst of the worst and was going nowhere with his life. His mom even said she expected him to be dead or in prison one day. And he went to an alternative to ODYS, Lighthouse, an alternative to juvenile prison, and that was Lighthouse. And he received therapy-based services, and that transformed his life. And now he's working at Amazon and doing really well. And he's also preparing for college and he's getting his license. And, they go on to have these wonderful lives. And if you just look at who they are on paper, it's easy to assume that they're going nowhere and to cast them aside. And that's what we need to really stop doing.
Thanks, Caitlin. And I know we're going to come back and sort of dig a little bit deeper on diversion. If there, before we move on, John, is there anything you wanted to add to this idea of the developmental understanding of adolescence and how kids are different, and whether you saw that show up?
It's such a big deal in this world of juvenile justice, this idea of we kept on coming back to it over and over and over again. One of the cool things about what we were able to do with this project is tell 30 different stories and marry them with 30 different themes. At least that was the goal. And our first week of stories was, kind of thematic. There was an intro and we're introducing the idea of bind over, but really the two major themes that made it into that first week, because they were so colossal, was trauma, which we've talked about, and brain science. Brain science is such a big deal that the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, has, in ruling after ruling, a half a dozen, basically said kids are different because they're part of their brain that develops kind of thought process and rationale and impulsivity and self-control is still developing past age 20, past age, like up to age 25. So we wanted that to kind of be front and center of the project. And one of the fun things where we could kind of be a little bit more creative, when Caitlin and I were just kind of having our meetings, was which story narrative to match with which theme. We wanted to do trauma, and we had a kid named Reese. Brain science. We had a kid named Reese, I think, with trauma, and this wonderful way that Caitlin became known for, this aha moment. I come into the newsroom and she said, "I figured it out. You were right." And I wasn't right. It wasn't my idea. It was actually hers. But she was like, "I think we're going to match Reese to brain science." And she was like, he even said it. His quote was, "I was so childish. I was so childish. I wasn't using my brain." I don't think Reese knows about Supreme Court case law, and I don't think he knows about all the reasons why we do treat kids differently in the criminal justice system. But he said it like he knew it. He looked back and he was like, something wasn't firing on all cylinders, and he was just being honest. And so we matched his story with the brain science. And I have to tell like one other personal story with this, because it's such a big deal. Like during the reporting, like the project is on your mind 24/7. You can't get away from it. And I went to visit my mom, and we were watching home videos, because I guess that's what you do when you visit your mom. So I was looking at my like 15-year-old self, and it was like I was having my way with a piñata, and I looked kind of psycho. I was really hyper, like maniacal, and almost vicious with it. And I just kind of remember back to when I was a kid, and I was a little off the chain in terms of how hyper I was, and I made a lot of dumb decisions. So I think one of the reasons why the reporting was almost not easy, but made sense for me, is because maybe I tap in easily to my immaturity of youth. So, but I couldn't help but think like, oh my God, what if 15-year-old me had access to a gun? I literally thought that watching this home video with my mom, because that's what's on my mind. Or what if I wasn't like a white kid with a little privilege? Or what if I didn't have a loving mom? Or any of these factors that make it kind of like a there, but for the grace of God go I kind of mentality. And you think, if one thing doesn't go my way, I'm wrapped up into this world of criminal justice that does kind of catch so many kids in the city.
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague to keep going. Appreciate it.
So, while we have this understanding of what the science tells us about adolescent brains, and while our system is built on that fundamental difference between children and adults, we have bind over laws in Ohio and across the country, where we've decided that certain young people shall or could be treated as an adult, even though they don't have the capacity, right, as you all just noted, to function in the same way adults do. And so your series, focused heavily on those kids who end up in the adult criminal legal system through that bind over process. So I'm curious, how your understanding of the use of bind over evolved throughout your reporting.
Um, I mean, it's so complex. That's the one thing that I figured out really quickly. Like we could do a whole webinar just on bind over. We reported this project for 8 months, and I feel like I didn't completely understand it until 8 months later. So there's a lot that goes into it. I think one of the main things to know is there are two forms of bind over. There's mandatory, which automatically triggers a kid based on the charging decisions to adult court, and there's discretionary, which leaves the discretion up to a judge, and we can talk about both of them separately. Caitlin mentioned that Cuyahoga binds more kids over than anywhere else in Ohio. It's something like more than the next four most populous counties combined. So one of the parts of our education was the way we're trying to figure out, like, is it that kids in Cleveland are committing more crimes? Is that's what's happening? Are they committing more heinous crimes? We have, Columbus is larger. I guess Cincinnati is kind of the similar population, but we have similarly populated counties, and they're binding a ton less kids over than we are. But when we crunched the data, and Caitlin drove this, we kind of said, no, at least with Cincinnati, Hamilton, they're considering bind over just as much as we are, about just as much as we are. So whether that means they're filing the initial motion, I guess they are. But then what I learned, I guess, is it's just kind of like stage one for a negotiation. And 90% of criminal justice in the system, I feel like, is one big deal to be had between prosecutors and defense attorneys. It's all negotiation, and like you go to the federal courts and nothing goes to trial because everybody agrees on a plea deal. So same thing with bind overs. I think a lot of other counties, at least Hamilton, say, all right, we have this leverage. Now, would you like to drop down ag robbery with a gun to kidnapping so you're not automatically transferred to adult court? We can work with you on that, but we might set it up where it's a dual sentence. So if you screw up in youth detainment, you can then be kicked to adult court. There's lots of choices that you can make. So in terms of how our enlightenment evolved, I think was just kind of learning the legal nuances of this complicated system, and also realizing that there are choices to be made. Nothing is in a silo.
And speaking of the choices aspect, I'm Desi and I's story just resonates with me, and I think on the week 2 where you covered mandatory bind over as well, it seemed that there were choices there, and in each case, the prosecutor chose to seek the harshest option possible, which was mandatory bind over. So I'm curious if there was a story in particular that seemed to underscore concerns that you saw echoed throughout the bind over process for the majority or a number of youth that you worked with on reporting the stories, and whether that informed how you presented the issues in any way.
That's a good question. I think that I think going back to the idea of like the subjectivity involved, like why is one kid who committed a carjacking bound over and another kid who committed a carjacking not bound over? Why is one kid who didn't have a criminal record who committed a carjacking bound over, and one kid who did have a criminal record who committed a carjacking not bound over? So I think it was a little eye-opening when we found that many of these kids, and the prosecutor's office has a system. It's not just one person, it's a team, and they're hard decisions, and they represent victims, and they're doing what they believe to be is their job. But again, going back to this idea of like if the kid has never set foot in a courtroom before and he gets in trouble for the first time, isn't the system set up to offer a second chance? The other thing in terms of like subjectivity crosses over to discretionary bind overs, and again, mandatory is triggered by prosecutor decisions or crimes if it's a murder. And discretionary. You give the review and the discretion to judges. But the subjectivity there, one case sticks out. So a 15-year-old committed murder. He's not eligible for mandatory bind over because he's not yet 16. A juvenile judge decides you're not amenable, you're not redeemable before age 21. We're going to kick you over to the adult court. When he gets to adult court, the prosecutor's office stacks additional homicide-related charges onto that case, maybe to help them with a plea deal, maybe because it's the process. Be that as it may, you can stack charges. In the meantime, the Supreme Court comes down and says, well, if a juvenile judge dismisses a charge against a kid and he's then bound over, you can't re-add those charges. So in this kid's case, the 15-year-old who did murder, his lawyer looked at those additional charges and said, oh, we now have case law that says that's not allowed. So his case goes back to juvenile court, and the judge, who a year beforehand had said you're irredeemable by the system, looks at him after he's had a year and a half of juvenile services and has to say, you actually are. You're doing great. You're doing awesome, and you're completely amenable to the system. And I have an opportunity to do a course correction, and I'm now going to keep you in the system till you're 21. Another quick example, we were looking at a kid who committed a series of carjackings like 5 years ago, and he was bound over, and he got 8 to 10, I think. And then we attended an amenability hearing, and we couldn't believe that this kid in front of us had the same, almost identical facts in terms of his case. 4 carjackings in a 2-week period, severe neglect, 15 years old. He was on probation for one other crime. He fired a shot during one of them. And it was almost uncanny how identical these fact patterns were. And he was not bound over because the judge determined that he hadn't had a chance of every single programming opportunity. So this is no one's fault. This is not necessarily a surprise that judges are subjective. This isn't a science. They're going to differ with other judges. Sometimes they'll differ from their own previous decisions. So I'm not saying it's a flaw in the system, but it's just something that jumped out, this level of subjectivity.
And I just real quickly, I wanted to give John a chance to speak first because Desanaya was one of his kids. But one of the things that struck me through this process as well was that the juvenile court was created, when it was created, we only had these discretionary bindovers. And that meant that every kid had some kind of review, an analysis of not only the crime, but their home life and everything else going on, their chances of reform. And that changed later when we added mandatory bindover, which means if you are charged with certain crimes, you don't get a review. You're automatically sent over to the adult system as long as there's probable cause to believe that you committed that crime. But as I saw, that is a very low bar. The judges will tell you themselves that is an extremely low bar. And when you say the charge murder is murder, which we've heard a lot through this series, John, it's really annoying to me because when you read stories like Ephraim's story, did that qualify as murder, attempted murder? Demetrius's story, did that qualify as attempted murder? They're not even accused of having a gun in their hands. And I went into Demetrius's case cold. I didn't know anything about him. I showed up in court and I sat in like a juror would, hearing his case for the first time. And I had extreme doubt about his involvement in the case, just hearing, the evidence for myself. And so it's just was really shocking to me that the system allows someone like Demetrius to go straight on to the adult system without any kind of review over other than that probable cause. So that was really shocking and disappointing.
And just to be clear of those facts, I mean, Caitlin picks the great 2 examples. So in the case of Ephraim, he had no criminal record, not any charge to speak of, and he accompanies a gunman who shoots at somebody and wounds him, I guess. And Ephraim is charged as if he had the gun in his hand, attempted murder. With Demetrius, he accompanies with his own friend somebody, I forget what the reason was that they were going to this person's house. And the person behind the door, there is a altercation, and the person behind the door shoots his own friend. And Demetrius, whose own friend got shot, is now charged with felony murder because he is a participant in the act that led to a murder. Both kids are downtown. Caitlin, what happened with Demetrius? Do you know what his resolution was?
That case is going to trial in July, or it's set for trial. We'll see if it doesn't get continued. But yeah, he's at ODYS right now, actually, on a different case. But thank you, John, because I'm assuming for the sake of time that everyone has read the series, and I'm not going into all of the details. So thank you for the background.
Sure. And Leah, just because you mentioned Desania, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what kind of jumped out and prompted the question for you. But I do remember like another layer of subjectivity. One of the reasons why some people like discretionary bind over more than mandatory bind over is because instead of allowing one office to determine what happens, we have not only judges who are quote unquote expert because they're in the juvenile system, but you have an entire investigation poured into, and it can take weeks or months, into what's best for the kid, what's best for society. Let's look at the family background. Let's look at the school background. Let's bring in a psychologist, a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist, and really do, a checkup on this kid. That makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. And when you look at it from a psychology standpoint, you think, all right, who better than a psychologist to determine whether or not this kid can be redeemed by the juvenile system? And sometimes the psychologist says the evidence suggests that they can, and the judge says, no, I'm going to bind them over anyway. And that's what happened with Desania. The psychologist said, she's doing really well when she's medicated, when she's in the supervision of people in authority in the detention center. And she's got 5 more years. She's 15, 16. She's got 5 more years to be rehabilitated. Another case where she was part of a murder, but not the gun woman, the gun girl. And the judge said, no, we're going to bind you over. So that struck me. And again, like, you have some people who say the psychologist doesn't know everything, and that's true. The judge is privy to more information, but it still was jarring that this professional forensic psychologist who's paid to prognosticate these things is not dismissed, but disagreed with.
Yeah, you really just captured the factors that for me made that story stick out, especially given that, if there's a possibility that a young person is capable of making that change, given the time we have with them, you would think our system would lean heavily into giving them that chance, right, instead of the opposite. But so thank you for diving into some of the facts of those kids' cases, just so that everybody here can understand it. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Gabriella.
Great. So we're coming back to sort of the juvenile system itself. At least, your reporting really shed light on how it's much more than the courtroom and the detention center. But really, the court administration runs a number of programs, or they contract with, community providers that are striving to meet a young person's needs while diverting them, from going deeper in the system, or at least hopefully doing that. Would you share a story or a story or two that really you think illustrates what you learned about how the court tries to work with youth who come into contact with the system and tries to keep them from going further?
Sure. So there were 2 programs that really stuck out to me. One was the Community-Based Intervention Center, and this is where kids they're exiting from juvenile detention. And so they come to the CBIC, and it's half a day of schoolwork to get caught up in their classes, a lot of credit recovery. And the other half of the day is to really, it's like cognitive therapy to change their thinking, and which then changes their behaviors. And that was really interesting to see, because almost all of the kids going through that program were successful, right? When you receive therapy and you're in a structured environment, you're very successful. But what we saw was when they're exiting that program, things started to fall apart. They returned to the same environment, and half of the kids that I worked with through that program, they ended up going AWOL or, committing new crimes. because they returned to the exact same environment, and their thinking had changed, but their needs had not. And so a lot of the behaviors that drove them to crime in the first place, they just fell right back into that. And just one story that really stuck out to me was this kid. He had a very sweet heart. I actually saw him be bullied a little bit in CBIC. And when he returned home, he was bit by a dog and it got infected, which CBIC staff reported that it wasn't being treated. So DCFS staff went to his home, saw that the dog was actually being chained inside of his room. And his grandfather, who he was living with at the time, kicked him out because DCFS showed up at the house, right? And now they're being investigated. So he's on the run. He was in the streets. We didn't know where he was. And he was doing so well in CBIC. But, you know, as Trish said in the series, there are just environmental aspects that you can't overcome. And that's why programs like MST that John mentioned in the beginning, the multi-systemic therapy, those go into the home and they work with the entire family. And that's what's really needed to heal the entire unit, and not just, you know, fix the child, but change the environment, because that's when we saw kids being the most successful. Sam, he went to live with a grandmother. He changed his environment and he excelled. You know, we just saw that over and over again, that when those circumstances change, kids are able to be successful.
Yeah, thank you for that. And how just horrific, you know, how some of those things can just kind of catch up and with a child and ending up on the streets in that way. And I know we've already touched on sort of how trauma was pervasive in so many of our kids' stories. I also know that you talked with kids adults in the community who served as informal mentors or formal mentors, or other ways, like Coach Ginn, who, you know, you quoted, I think. Is there some, you know, can you give an example of someone who you saw in the community who really tried to show up, you know, for our kids, and you see it really making a difference?
Yeah, two really come to mind to me. Number one was Fahim with New Era Cleveland, and he's got some perhaps controversial tactics, strategies that he uses with his armed patrols and things like that. But wow, does he really care about kids? And he shows up for them, and he does, you know, community breakfasts and get them involved in community service. And he tries to fix, you know, some of those needs that kids are seeking to fill, that void, the mentorship, the poverty, you know, setting them up with jobs and clothing. They've opened a resource center for kids. So those things are really important. He was a great resource for us as well. And then the group Building Freedom Ohio, BFO, they have a ton of mentors in there. And they were actually, we went to several of their meetings, John and I. They were actually talking about starting some kind of group where they would go into schools. Could they be mentors to kids in schools and do talk therapy in school, things like that? So we see a lot of grassroots efforts of the community trying to heal itself and trying to be, you know, resources for these kids outside of the criminal justice system. And many of them have knowledge of the justice system. And that lived experience gives them a lot of credibility with these youth.
Thank you for sharing those. I want to make sure that we point out that your series, of course, also focused on victims, and it, you know, noting the very real pain and harm that's been caused by some of our young people, as well as community violence in general. And as you rightly pointed out, often our kids are on, you know, both sides of this violence themselves. Personally, I was really struck by the empathy that was expressed by some of those who'd been victimized. And like Bianca's father, I think was one, but there are several. What struck you most in those conversations with victims?
Caitlin, you want to talk about Bianca?
Yeah, I want to give John a lot of credit here, because it was his idea that we needed to have an entire section focused on victims. But I did reach out to Bianca's family, and this was a family that I found through research online. And you had one side of the family, which was Bobby's family, that did not think that justice went far enough, you know, with these kids that they avoided bind over because their judge felt that they were redeemable. This was for both of them, their first time ever touching the system. And then you had Brianka's dad, who he was a law enforcement officer for 30 years, and he saw both sides of the system where kids got a slap on the wrist, as well as when, it was too harsh. And he felt that binding them over, treating them like adults was not going to do anybody any good. It did not bring his daughter back. It did not get justice for his family. And it also did not help the kids themselves, because he felt that they would come out and be worse off in the long run. Kind of ironically, the girl that was in that case, she did not turn out very well. She did reoffend. She assaulted a police officer, and she's still involved in the justice system. The boy, however, he is very successful right now, and he had a lot of empathy for the family, cried with them in court. And that, to me, is what really stood out in all of these stories, is that most of the victims were just looking for some sort of acknowledgement of the harm that had been caused and an apology. And so there's a lot of there's a lot we can do in that space to provide that mediation, right? And so that victims feel like they're getting a level of accountability. The kids are understanding the harm that they caused, which makes them less likely to do it again. And there's the prevention piece that we're all hoping for. John, I know you had more to say.
Really, no. I mean, I think that sums it up. I think that, we didn't want every single story to be kind of a duplicate of the other. We wanted everything to be novel. So, first of all, we did want to include the victim piece because this was not advocacy journalism. And I know a lot of people might feel like it can be construed as it, and it's not. I mean, this is down the middle as much as we can. And so much of what we do as criminal justice journalists and crime journalists is share the victim's perspective. Not in this project, I'm just saying in general, for all the right reasons, and their voice is as important, if not more important than any. But this was a special project where we were kind of giving a perspective to a community that doesn't get it a lot, but we did include it because we wanted to be as fair as we could. And in terms of the what Caitlin was talking about in terms of allowing people to kind of own the crime and resolve it together in a way that they can move on, heal in peace. We talk about the idea of restorative justice. This is kind of like, some people kind of construe it as a novel, kind of cutting edge approach, which doesn't seem too novel to me, just because it makes sense and it's pretty simple. And I know that Cuyahoga is kind of attempting to do this. They're in the very beginning stages. But that was what I think a hole in our series. It didn't have a true example of restorative justice that maybe other counties could have offered, or maybe we just didn't see it in terms of our outreach. So if we did a follow-up series on juvenile justice in 5 years, hopefully by then we will have an example of a restorative justice case.
Thanks. I appreciate you lifting that up, and I agree wholeheartedly. And it's something that we hope to see in our communities, both for our young people and for the community, because I think it's something that certainly can support them, support all of us. I'm mindful of the time, so I want to turn it over for our last set of questions before we open up to the audience. So thank you.
Thank you both, John and Caitlin. It's been a really fruitful conversation so far. I wanted to talk to you all a little bit more about the role of media in this system, and if you think it plays a role. And we know that crime has been, well, we know as the policy people that crime has been on a downward trend for many years, but the public seems to believe that crime is increasing rapidly. And this is largely driven in a lot of cases by media coverage that utilizes more fear-based rhetoric and dehumanizing language, which kind of creates panic in our communities. We saw this happen in the 1980s and the 90s, and it's reminiscent of the emergence of the super predator myth, which had and continues to have devastating effects on Black youth in our community and nationwide. And in fact, many of the punitive policies that you all talked about, like bind over, mentioned in that series, were passed during that time. So for me, personally reading, I thought this series was really refreshing because it went beyond the stereotypes and beyond the statistics and centered stories of real people. And your reporting took great strides to actually humanize all of those who were involved in the stories. So I just wanted to ask you both if you were mindful of this history and the role of media in perpetuating harmful narratives when you decided to do this series, and did this impact how you reported and rolled out this series on Cleveland.com?
Definitely. I think we're all aware of the power that we have in the media, that we, can drive certain narratives. I will say, I do think it is our responsibility to let communities know what is happening. And so when we have, the rash of car break-ins, we need to let people know what to look for so that they can help protect themselves. So it's not necessarily reporting less on certain things, but like you said, it's how we report on it. And that's what was so different about this series, is that it wasn't just about what the kids did, it was about how they got to that point. And so that's my biggest takeaway for other media, is to tell the full story of, before, during, and after, to get a full scope of how we got here, because that's going to point to all the points where someone or something could have intervened. And the whole goal of this is to prevent victims in the first place.
And also, I'll also say that the only reason we pulled this project off is because we had time. We requested documents and we got them weeks, sometimes months later. To get connected with people behind bars, it was a time-consuming process. And the reason we had time, and this is when I do have to give credit to our editor, Chris Quinn, he conceived of this a few years ago, and finally said, now is the time to do it. And frankly, when he pitched us the idea, I was almost considering the idea that we were being set up for failure. You want us to get sealed documents that tell a bunch of stories and then somehow connect with, first of all, we have to figure out who these kids who are bound over are or going through the system, get their documents, then connect with maybe their lawyers or their families. And I just wasn't sure of the feasibility. And we dipped our toe for a month and saw what we could do. And it wasn't really a fruitful first month, but I think we did enough. And Chris said, keep going. And the next month he said, keep going. And the message was always like, take the time that you need. And that was kind of like a reporter's dream project. This could not have happened. It was an 8-month project. It could not have happened in half the time. So I think, that's one answer too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think really thinking of the time that you all spent in this, and it really is apparent and how the reporting is done. And just, Caitlin, you talking about how you have close relationships with some of the youth and you're following their cases, and John, and how you know their stories and you know them by name, I think says a lot about the time that you spent. So going off of that, I wanted to also ask, how were you personally impacted by the series? And we kind of talked about that a little bit, but do you think that impact will approach how you approach these kind of stories in the future and how you report?
I think of the impacts. There was one case where, and I don't know if this will impact my direction, and I'll try and sum up the story, but there was one case where I connected with a person who'd been bound over. He was behind bars, and we kind of got to know each other. And I explained the project, and he said, I'm in. And I ended up talking to his mom. And that was like months ago. And then we kept the conversation going, and I got his records back. And there was a severe mental illness going on. And there was also a lot of domestic violence going on in the household perpetrated by the kid. And by the time we had this narrative, and I was running the facts by the mom, I clearly triggered her. And it was a case where she didn't really know the depths of where this would go. She didn't give me permission to get police reports. I ended up talking to the kid again, and he was upset. And the idea was, it was a mental illness case, and I didn't really tell them up front that this was going to be I never even broached the subject at the time. And I had this story based on subsequent reporting. And the idea, I think, was that this could cause harm if the story came out, because he'd know about all the troubles that they're trying to move beyond when he does get out of prison in I guess, a year and a half. So ethically, we were on solid footing to tell the story from a professional standpoint. But I was cognizant of the imbalance of power. I was cognizant of the idea that I felt like I was using a situation to our gain. And we talked to our editor and we killed the story. And I don't know if I would do this in every situation going forward, because again, journalistically, we were okay. But I think that it had a profound impact on me, and I didn't want to be doing this for the wrong reasons. So I guess if there was a lesson for me, it's that it's okay. The greater story will be told, but there are sometimes you don't want to screw up people's lives.
Yeah, and I know we're getting close to time. I want to leave time for questions, but I did just want to say, Chris, when he announced this series, he talked about the cost to the newspaper, right? For John and I being away from our beats for 7 months and, making it free for everyone to read, which was really important to John and I. But also there was a human cost to us, a mental health cost specifically. And it really just opened my eyes. I'm getting calls from kids in the middle of the night. They haven't eaten that day. And, they're opening up to both of us about the abuse and that the secondary trauma that we took on living this with them really just opened my eyes to not only the trauma that they themselves are going through. I needed therapy leaving this project because it was just so hard for me. But imagine all the people that are dealing with this every day, the judges, the attorneys, the social workers, the kids themselves and their families. And so that was just really important for me to see firsthand. And that's what I really want to take away. And I hope other media take away from this is, to get up close and really understand the whole story and don't just rely on the police narrative or the prosecutor narrative or, whatever court document you can get, because a lot of times it's only one side of the story.
Thanks so much for that. We have one question. I know we're at time, but one of these questions were also raised in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and add this. But I want to also acknowledge what both of you said, Caitlin and John. I think what you said about getting close. I had a former boss of mine who always talked about getting proximate to the people in order to serve them and to actually know what is happening. And I think that's what you all did. And you saying that kind of call to action to your colleagues is just really important. And I know all of us on this, the other panelists can really resonate with the trauma and how heavy it is to do this work all the time and emotionally taxing. So you talked about this a little bit, but what are your advice or calls to action to your peers that are covering the criminal legal system and youth in particular, and also to your readers? I know you talked about getting close, getting proximate, but if there are any other call to actions moving forward, and then for us as readers, this was also raised in the chat, that you want us to keep in mind as we really reflect on this series and its one-of-a-kind nature, and hopefully we see more reporting like this in the future.
I think just remember when you were a kid, we were all kids, and we were all on varying degrees of idiots, I think. And if you just kind of, in terms of like this kind of reporting, we were talking about juvenile justice, it's easier to empathize, literally empathize with the kid if you remember that you were a kid and you made dumb choices too. No, you weren't perfect, and you made it. People make it. But if you just kind of remember, if you watch a home video when you're visiting your mom, what you were like, it makes this kind of reporting a little bit more, little bit more easy and a little bit more impactful, I think.
And my call to action for readers is just to come to this with an open mind, and also be part of the solution. I just wrote about this last week. These kids tell us the number one thing that they need is mentors. They need positive role models in their life, particularly male figures. And so if you have a little bit of time or have it in your heart to be a mentor, please consider that. I just started mentoring myself. I became a big sister through Big Brothers Big Sisters. So just that's my biggest call to action is these kids are looking for someone, and that's all of us. We can all be someone for them.
Thank you both so much. So I think we're going to move into the Q&A portion now. We had a lot of great questions rolling in. So I am going to take a look here and see. I will be moderating the Q&A portion, just so you all know. So we have the county's current approach. We also have some people who shared some thoughts. So I want to make sure that I share some of their thoughts as well. The county's current approach to juvenile crime defined by the most recent local election cycle, with the prosecutor stating that the prosecutor's office has no choice but to bind over children, that our children are the worst of the worst of the worst. Based on your research, what would you hope our prosecutors learn from this series?
I know John's waiting for me
I'm gonna pass that one to you. You lead the charge here.
I think they themselves get caught up on one side too. They have an obligation to listen to the victim and the victim's family. And so that pulls at the heartstrings for them too. And they also have to follow the law. But look at the resources that we have available. That's what the system is designed to do, is to reform. And so those resources should be working. But the number one thing that I think was kind of flew under the radar in our series that I think needs more attention is that there is actually a third option. In addition to mandatory bind over and discretionary bind over, there is this serious youthful offender status. And that is where kids are given a juvenile sentence first. And if that is not successful, then they can go on to the adult system. But it gives them a chance at reform in the juvenile system first. And that is extremely underutilized in this county. And I'm not exactly sure why that is.
Another thing to keep in mind is the narrative, and this goes back to Leah's question about like super predators, but it just always seems like youth are running amok. These kids today, they're out of control. It just seems like that's the narrative, when since the high point of like the early 90s, on the whole, youth crime has gone down. And I think that it's easy to get sucked into last year, which was really violent in Cleveland. And there is evidence that youth crime was up last year. If you look at arrests, if you look at just homicides, kids charged with homicide crimes. But that is 1 year out of a trajectory where it's continuing to go down. And Caitlin plucked out a lot of good data that has reinforced the idea that even within the last 5 years, many crimes have gone down in terms of kids. And I had one other point, and I forgot what it was. Oh, I remember reporting on the car theft crisis last year, and I was talking to a Cleveland State, I think he was a social worker, and he was like, this is a blip. We look at these blips over the course of history, and it just seems like a blip. And I remember last year thinking, right. I mean, this seems like a huge issue. It's a huge spike, and I don't see an end to it. And we haven't been hearing about it this year. And he might be right. I think he is probably right. It might have, I mean, in 5 years, we'll look back at 2023 as a blip. So something to think about.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we know, we see the data that crime is going down, and we may have these blips, but we certainly don't see the same amount of tension of when we know the crime is going down in the public discourse. No one is going around saying crime is down, but when we have the blips, everyone is going around saying that it's the worst that it's ever been. So I think that perspective is really helpful. We have another question actually from a student who is majoring in journalism and criminal justice studies at Ohio State. And they say, throughout my studies, we have always been taught that maintaining status as an unbiased media is required. And as journalists, how do you navigate the necessity to create media that raises awareness for social justice issues through storytelling, while meeting or not meeting the universal expectation of journalistic impartiality?
This is always a struggle for me because I am on the public advocacy team. And so that is a constant struggle with my editor of, how far is too far for me as a journalist? What am I comfortable with? But I think John said it earlier, we just tried to stick with the documents and stick with the facts and stayed down the middle, and we gave everyone a chance to speak. And I think that it doesn't get any fairer than that.
That's true. And there's not an easy way to answer that question, because there's not one form of journalism. Nothing is black and white. There's a big umbrella, and you can go from opinion pieces and essays to news blurbs where you're just quoting from a police report. So I think that as a former journalism student, I think the advice would be like, stick to the North Star of, speaking with facts and making sure you get every side of the story. Don't leave anyone out, no surprises. But then like find your voice. If you want to, write big kind of like, big vocal pieces for the New Yorker where you can be a little bit dramatic with your thoughts, or if you want to write opinion pieces for, I don't know, pick your um, editorial left or right. I'm thinking of TV left and right. I guess you can do the same thing with print. But the bottom line is figure out what you want to do in terms of how you want us to be heard, but stick to the facts and seek every single part of the opinion.
Thank you. We have, this question has a couple of questions within it, so you can sort through them, but I think they're all semi-related, so you'll be able to wade through them. But this person is just talking about how in 25 years of engaging on juvenile justice issues in Ohio, they've never seen a series on delinquency that looked behind the crimes like this, which we talked a lot about. And so in this era of tough on crime, that it always seems to be an era of tough on crime, we seem to come out of it and go right back into it. But how are you able to break through this landscape, and how, and spending this time? I know you mentioned your editor really allowing you all to take a break from your daily reporting. But I think another interesting question within this is, what reaction have you had from justice system players, especially the court and prosecutors and people? I know the court let you in, and where you were able to get access to these records. So now that the series has been published, what kind of reaction have you all received?
So the first part of that question, this really could not have worked without cooperation from the court. And that was something that it seems like a fluke to me. They might argue differently, but I've been reporting on the county for a while, and they reached out to me actually and said, we want people to know what we're doing here. We don't think, most people see our courthouse and they only see the detention center, the jail, and they don't know all the other work that is going on here. And so they invited me for 2 weeks to tour every section of the juvenile court, the probation department, placement, everything. And they answered some tough questions. They opened themselves up for whatever story that we were going to get out of it. And that's what kind of started this series. That was the window that I think Chris was looking for, to say, okay, now is the time to tell this story, because they wanted it told, no matter what the outcome was. And the response I've received so far has been extremely thankful. There were some tough days, especially when we get into discretionary bindover, which is really the judge's decision, and they're not popular decisions. And we got to peek behind that curtain and showed exactly how the judges think and the wide discretion that they have, and the inconsistency, I think, that goes on there between the different judges. And they still came out of this saying thank you. And I hope that they keep the door open, because these are important stories, and the only way to keep improving the system is to keep sharing these stories of what's working, where it's not working, why, and what more can we do to change that.
I think the juvenile court's lack of defensiveness is not something that's modeled by other county agencies. And Caitlin is as fierce and as tough-minded a journalist as they come. And when she comes and says, "Can you open your books?" and you say yes, you're probably doing something right, actually. So, you can't do that with every agency, but I echo Caitlin when she says the strength of this project came just from cooperation. So everybody we talked to, as far as I could tell, seemed like really good people trying to do the right thing. So this was a case where it was truly kind of working together, and hopefully for the betterment of the municipality.
Thank you. I think that's really refreshing to hear. I don't think people always think that when they hear about the courts, and to know that we do have a court that's allowing people to come in and really get these stories out and advocate on behalf of our youth. We have another question about, do you have any thoughts about the quality of legal representation for these kids that you reported on?
there's a huge debate about that. We didn't really, fan those flames, but there is a debate on whether they should be represented by the public defender more often. I think our county is in a weird situation where we have the capacity. The public defender has the capacity to take more cases. So many stories I hear from other counties is the public defender is stretched so thin. You have these lawyers who are balancing 1,000 case files and have to meet with 20 people in prison in the course of half an hour. But I don't have an opinion on the actual debate because I'm not knowledgeable enough. Desania, the girl that we were talking about that Leah mentioned, what was part of her story is she had ineffective assistance of counsel, and her case she had to be bound over twice and go through 2 amenability hearings because the first time around, they found that her lawyer did not pay fees for years. He hadn't kept up on his continuing education classes. So that was just one example, and it wasn't necessarily like completely pertinent to the issues of bind over, but it's part of her story. Like, what are the chances that she has a lawyer who's not qualified? So if it happened to her, it happens. And the other thing I'll say is, 9 out of 10 lawyers I reached out to couldn't really be bothered with helping out. And that was actually a misjudgment I had. I thought that was going to be the way to get into the door, to open the door into these kids' cases. And that doesn't mean they're bad lawyers. There are plenty of good lawyers who don't want to help. But that was just surprising to me. The public defender was not that way. They were quite helpful.
Thank
I
you
really
for
don't
that.
have anything to add. I know you're looking at me, but John worked closely with the attorney side, and I think he summarized it pretty well, what we were up against.
Well, yes, we know that has been a big conversation within our county, and I suspect it will continue to be over the coming months. I have another question about, do you have plans to follow up on this series, either by reconnecting with the kids or exploring more deeply the aspects of the system that are troublesome? I know after 8 months, you all are probably ready to take much needed vacation and rest, but looking in the future, do you have plans to follow up?
I am definitely aware of several follow-up stories that I would like to do. I'm not ready to preview any of them yet. We're going to talk to our editors about them, but there's definitely going to be more coming. On the subject itself, I've also talked to juvenile court just again about keeping the door open. How do we keep reporting on some of these issues? And then several of our kids, their cases were pending as this series was publishing. And so I will be following up on them as well. You had Ephraim is eligible for early release from adult prison. And so I'm looking to see if that actually happens, and then what does he do with that freedom? And then also whatever happens to Demetrius's case in adult court. So there will definitely be follow-ups.
That's great to hear. I have a question that's a little bit of a follow-up to the advocacy question. It says, when a county where the attorney appointment system and the juvenile courts have come under increased scrutiny, I'd like to know how you both are thinking about how to deal with the gaps in a child's story that may prevent a judge from recognizing or selecting the best way forward for a child. And in terms of zealously advocating on behalf of a child as well.
I don't think we have any plans to advocate about what kind of representation they receive in court. I know that our paper has expressed interest in advocating at the state level to change the law to eliminate mandatory bind over and make sure that every kid has some kind of review. And so they're going to do that on their side. But as far as just following up on the attorney, I know that's a conversation that's going to keep happening, the attorney versus public defender debate. And right before I went on vacation, because I'm actually on vacation now, decompressing from the series, but I did watch the Public Defender Commission meeting where they talked about right now the juvenile court only has 4 private attorneys that are qualified to handle murder cases, attempted murder cases, and 4 for F1s as well. And so one of the things that stuck out to me was they did not do an audit to say, okay, of the kids being represented right now who have murder cases, how many of them are being represented by an attorney that is not technically qualified to represent them? They have not done that analysis yet, and that is something that needs to be done. So there's, again, another follow-up.
And how many appeals will come out of this scenario? Like, what kid has been represented by somebody who maybe wasn't qualified, who is now downtown or in an adult prison, who now has grounds for an appeal, and how much is that multiplied?
Yeah, I'll also add, this person in their question talks about just how you all constructed the histories of youth in your storytelling. And so hopefully there are attorneys that are able to do that same thing for the court when they're advocating on behalf of these youth, and how important it is to actually tell those stories.
And if I could just add just quickly on that point too, you know, we learned from these probation files, it's actually the probation officers that are putting together the histories of these kids in a report that they give to judges for review when they're making these decisions. And that's supposed to tell not only the kids' life history, but all the programs they received, how they were they successful in those programs, you know, how many crimes they've committed, that kind of thing. And one of the main things I noticed was those reports. Number one, we need better record keeping, because they would credit kids for certain programs that actually they didn't receive. Demetrius was one example. You would have read about it in his story where it said he'd received MST in the past, when actually it had been offered to his aunt. She declined it. So he never actually received that service, but it was written in his initial report as if he had. That would be counted against him as a program that was tried and failed. So we need better record keeping, and also we just need more probation officers. Demetrius had 4 probation officers in the few months that I knew him. And so how much can they really know a kid to fill out that report, which is what judges are basing a lot of their decision on. So those are 2 areas that we need to really improve so that kids have proper representation.
We also received a question about this. It says, this was an incredibly well done series. At the same time, it's striking that the series was produced by white reporters describing a system where power is mainly held by white elected officials, where most of the young people impacted by the system are Black. Did you talk about that internally?
John?
I think we did. I mean, first of all, great point. Absolutely. And perspectives left out, not intentionally, but just by virtue of the fact that, you know, we are a non-diverse duo, probably. We do the best we can, but if I had my druthers, we would have another team member who could add another perspective that could either help us write or help us better connect with the population we're talking to. But yes, I think we did acknowledge the elephant in the room, Caitlin.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
90% of kids bound over in Cuyahoga County are Black.
Thanks for that question. These are audience questions right now, so just want to reiterate, we have been through our questions, but I appreciate you all raising that. So I see that there's a question about, there's been so much debate about the new county jail and campus, and with the appointment of a new senior county official, the Justice and Health Equity Officer, do you think there are ways to connect the realities and lessons from your series to the huge jail campus project in ways that can be a catalyst for restorative justice practices in this county?
Well, you know, I do a lot of reporting on the jail, but that is an adult system. And the whole point of this series is to prevent kids from going on to the adult system. I guess the one thing I will say is we are hoping that this series does start a lot of conversations. And one important conversation where we hope, you know, this occurs is county council has created a juvenile justice committee to talk about how do we make changes and how do we reform the system to prevent more kids from entering in, and how do we address the fact that 90% of the kids that we bind over are Black youth. You know, those are the type of things that they can address. But as far as the actual adult jail, you know, my hope is that none of these kids that we talk to actually end up there. But I know that they are talking about doing a lot of things in the jail to help adult offenders, like, you know, a mental health wing, a bigger hospital, more medical services, more use of the diversion center on the adult side, so that, you know, we're not sending people with mental health or addiction issues to sit in jail. That's doing them no good. So those are the type of things that are happening on the adult side. But again, we hope we never see any of our kids there.
So have you thought, another audience member question, have you thought about looking into the trauma that occurs when CFS remove children from the families and how that early trauma affects kids becoming delinquent? I know you all talked about a lot of the traumas that you've seen throughout the series that are very complex. And I know there's just a lot of CFS conversation in our county right now. So I don't know if you explored that anymore throughout the series.
We had a stat in there, wasn't it, John? About 30% of the youth that were criminal justice involved also were DCFS involved.
Yeah,
So
and that came from the DOJ. The DOJ actually studied Cuyahoga County. They created a report and they studied 3 different counties, and one of them was Cuyahoga, and it was 30. I'm pretty sure it was 30%.
So we know there's a lot of overlap, and I know that Case Western also keeps track of that as well. And so again, that is a point of access where we can add preventions.
And I'm just going to ask one last question.
Actually, fact check. I did write this down. DOJ says more than 2/3 of Cuyahoga County youth who touch the juvenile justice system also have experienced child welfare.
Wow.
Not 1/3, 2/3. Excuse me.
Wow. I think that's something for us all to keep in mind as we're thinking about these systems. So I'm going to ask one last question before we close from an audience member. There's a quote, I believe, that was in the series, and it says that someone said, "We're not running a social service agency." I believe it was a judge who may have made this statement. Do you believe that makes rehabilitation less of a focus, which is why the detention center was started in the first place?
No, I don't. I think that the court has proven that they have a lot of programs meant to focus on reform before you touch detention and before you cycle deeper into the system. And we have a lot of stories where it works. You know, when you talk about 100 kids bound over in a year, that's awful, but also look at how many thousands of kids touch the system every year that don't go deeper. And so there's obviously things that the court is doing right. Otherwise, you'd have more kids that would keep cycling. So I do want to give a little bit of credit there. I don't think that that's the point of detention.
Well, thank you. I believe that is all for today. Thank you all for such a fruitful conversation, such thought-provoking answers, and I know that all of us will be really impacted. And thank everyone who joined us. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to close this out. And thank you all for spending a Tuesday evening with us.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came today. I know if we were all in person together, there would be an uproarious round of applause for John and Caitlin. It was such a fantastic conversation and really fruitful for all of us. And we really appreciate you joining us. I wanted to say to the attendees that the video, along with all the resources shared, will be shared with you at the close of this. And just finally, if there's any closing thoughts that John or Caitlin you have for us, we're welcome to them. But if not, thank you so much.
My last closing thought would just be a plug for mentorship and for people getting involved in the community and being part of this reform that we all want to see. Because again, no one wants victims, right? So we can all be part of that, of changing the system to prevent victims and also just helping these kids.
My last thought is to thank the kids or the young adults by now who talk to us, who talk to me, especially those who are behind bars and were vulnerable and gave a little trust to us. I remember when you asked the question about feedback, and the most gratifying piece of feedback I got was a text message from a kid who had been bound over. He chose not to participate in the project. He's almost out and he didn't want to, put up any risks. But he was one of the first people. I don't know how he heard about the series, but he got back in touch and he said it has gotten good reviews. I didn't even know he knew who I was anymore. So that made me feel good. So again, thanks to the kids who helped us. It wouldn't have been a project without their voice.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you both. Thank you to everyone attending. This has been really, really fantastic and really, really fruitful. So thank you.